Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from the 4th chapter in the book of Hebrews. We took off from the 14th verse of that chapter all the way till the 10th of the 5th. There, and we met our sympathetic high priest, who is likened to the order of Melchizedek in the material which comes after it in the 5th chapter. So the book of Hebrews consists of two themes interwoven. One is the personage of Yahshua Messiah. It's a highly sophisticated Christology, for lack of a better word. And the other is the warning of the potential of falling away and its dire consequences. What takes place after the material we're going to be covering today, and what we've already covered, is the first element, the sophisticated Christology, and the first 12 verses of the 4th chapter are in the second category, the warning against falling away. This trajectory is established as early as the 7th verse of the preceding chapter. In the first chapter, we are introduced to Yahshua Messiah, whose superiority and supremacy over the prophets and angels are declared in the first two chapters. Then we read of his superiority to Moses. And he is writing, the author of Hebrews, we don't know who it was. There's a variety of hypotheses. I've made my opinion known before. I'm not going to today. We know with greater certainty that it is who it is written to. These are Italian Jews, by birth and background, who had converted to Christianity, and they were succumbing to relapsing to the old inferior system, and he wanted them to remind them of the treasures that they had in the new covenant. And Moses would have been the most revered figure by ancient Jews and Jews today, but the Messiah's dominance is established, for one who has been deemed worthy of more esteem than Moses, as much as he who built the house enjoys more respect than the house. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all is Elohim. So Yahshua created Moses. He not only created him, he created all the stars, all the galaxies, all the solar systems. And as the architect, he is greater in respect and more meriting in some respect as the builder of the house than the one who occupies there. The one who occupies there, Moses, is a servant. He is a son of the Almighty. And Moses was faithful as a servant, but Yahshua was a son, and as such the servant can never usurp the son's rightful place. And then the 7th through the 11th verse, he quotes verbatim Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. He does this often. He is writing to a Jewish audience, which would have been familiar with the Old Testament. He's quoted the Psalms all over the place, and he does so with Jeremiah, a huge chunk in the 8th chapter. He does chapter 31, verses 31, 34. So this and that are probably the longest single ones, but it says in the 7th verse, therefore, as the Ruach Kadesh says, today, if you hear his voice. So this is the bottom part of the 7th verse of the 95th Psalm, and he quotes it, even though David wrote it, he wrote it under the inspiration of the Ruach Kadesh. So he makes clear that the word of Elohim is one way, that Yahweh speaks and Elohim speaks is made plain in the early introductory verses. But he warns them, do not harden your heart as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness. This would have been Meribah and Manna, which respectively translate as testing and wandering or something else. But they ended up staying there for 40 years, and the rest that they were forbidden to enter into is a temporal rest, the rest of the promised land. They had never known rest all their lives. They were born in bondage, and then they were liberated only to wander the desert for 40 years on account of their waywardness and fallenness. So they had heard the voice, but they had forsaken the blessing because they did not diligently obey. And that is the audience of Hebrews' dilemma. They have to embrace the new calling. In 11th verses, I swore in my wrath, if they shall not enter into my rest. So he swores. The oath on an oath is central to the Messiah. We read that Yahweh established an oath on himself, and also the Melchizedek priesthood, in opposition to the inferior Aaronic, is established by an oath. So there is significance to oath. Look out, brothers, lest there be in any of you a wicked heart of unbelief and falling away from the living Elohim. like father, like son, the history of the Jewish people is one unending essential failure. Collectively, they were an apostate people. There was always a righteous remnant, and the saints that the Jewish people have produced are beyond comparison in the nation of any world. But the majority, by law of nature, were fallen and rebellious and just apostate, idolatrous at various points, and sinful. But encourage the one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened by the deceit of sin. Sin is deceitful. It invites promises which result in diminished expectations and disappointed hopes. Sin seems pleasureful. It seems good. It seems fantastic in the moment, but it is all an illusion. It is all an allure. It is all a trap. It is all a snare. So don't be deceived by sin. Look past the surface and see the satanic supernatural presence lurking underneath sin. And today, at the end of the day, the beginning of the day, and everywhere in between, all we have is the present. We are geared towards the future. We have to forget the past, meaning that we, when we, as communicated in Paul by Philippians 3:8, where he says, forgetting the past, I press on towards the prize in the future. So, but all we have is the present, and we can shape our future by a responsible response to the present, which creates a ripple effect and an echo into which affects our future. So the urgency is the day. Now is the day of your salvation, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 6:2. While it is said today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So learn from your ancestors. Don't make the same mistake. Don't go the same route they went. And the same ingredients that was precipitated their downfall was unbelief and sin and rebellion. So you got to remove the element. You got to recognize it and expel it. Verses 18 and 19. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter into his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they were unable to enter in because of unbelief. So in the 4th chapter, he speaks of the rest of salvation. He uses the Sabbath in the Promised Land, the Exodus generation history, as pointing to the eternal rest that he is calling them to embrace. But the same thing which disqualified the wilderness wanderers from laying foot in the Promised Land was their rebellion and sin and hard-heartedness, and he's imploring his audience, his immediate, and us by connection to hold on and maintain fast to the new revelation of the new covenant. First verse, 4th chapter, book of Hebrews. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering into his rest, let us fear that any of you seem to have come short of it. We learn two things, that there is a rest, there is a salvation. This is the rest that he speaks of. It is eternal salvation in the proximate presence of our Maker. But the possibility is that it is not guaranteed. So the possibility and the potentiality of us falling short of it is real, present, and palpable. And we should fear. We should use that fear as a motivating factor to stimulate, to supplement our love. Now, our sense of faith must exceed our sense of fear. This is a mature believer, but any mature believer who ceases to lose that sense of fear will lapse into spiritual immaturity. And the author of Hebrews in the 5th chapter, the beginning in the 11th verse, he likens spiritual nourishment and growth and development to spiritually analogous milk and hard, solid meats, respective for their capabilities to digest. For indeed the good news was brought to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, not having been mixed with faith, but in those who heard it. So the good news, they had the good news. The good news is that their lives as slaves, and they were redeemed people. They had a land of milk and honey awaiting them. They just had to walk through the wilderness, but during there they hardened their hearts, and their rebellion became... So they did not make the most of the message of Sinai while Moses was up getting the ground blueprints for what would become the tabernacle. They had succumbed to idolatry in the 40-day period. That's all it took for them to relapse into the slavery of idolatry. And so without the essential ingredient of faith, we cannot make the most of the message or lay hold to the promises or grasp the exalted expectations that it offers. So hearing, spiritual hearing, ears of faith is how we grasp the message. The message is that they had was good news, but it wasn't the same message that we receive. We receive the best news of all. For we who have believed do enter into that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, and yet his works have come into being from the foundation of the world. So that is what we read in the 11th verse of the 3rd chapter of Hebrews, and also the 11th verse of the 95th chapter of Psalms, as I have sworn in my wrath. But earlier than that, we read that belief, righteousness by faith, our righteousness is measured and established by faith. This is communicated by Paul in passages such as Romans 1:17, and also Galatians, and also the author of Hebrews cites the same passage from Habakkuk 2:4 and 10:38. The theme of righteousness by faith, our righteousness in our rest is attained by faith through grace, by grace through faith. And the one who finishes it all, the architect and the author of our salvation, the captain of our salvation from start to finish, he created the cosmos. He was there in the beginning. He was there before the beginning. And his rest is eternal as he is eternal. For somewhere he has said thus about the seventh day, and Elohim rested on the seventh day from all his works. This we read in Genesis 2:2. This is when the creation was complete, so Yahweh rested, not because he was tired, not because he is an indefatigable being. He rested in the sense that a lawyer rests their case. So on the seventh day, this is the original Saturday, and that was the day that he sanctified. And once the Jews became redeemed people, he commanded that they commemorate creation and their redemption with the day of rest. This was something they did not know. So from a life of backbreaking toil, just all day, every day, and throughout the day, excruciatingly oppressive physical manual labor, they had a day of rest in which they ceased from toil. And in this, again, if they shall enter into my rest, so he quotes the same passage we've already commentated, but whenever someone repeats something in any work of literature, the reader must take note and attention, and how much more so with the Bible than any other work of literature, for by its dictates and precepts, individuals are saved or damned, and nations rise and fall. We have to take this book seriously, and anything that is repeated, we have to re-register and renew in our mind. It's there for a reason. Since then it remains for some to enter into it, and those who formerly received the good news do not enter in because of disobedience. So therein we learn there's nothing universal, there's nothing automatic, there's nothing guaranteed about this blessed, exalted state of expectation, this blessed abode, which is eternal rest in heaven, in his presence, where he is the lamp and he is the temple, the Father and the Lamb serve in those capacities. But even those who had the good news, now salvation comes from the Jews, but this is also can be applied to the reality of the Gentiles, they were a more captive audience to the good news in a lot of ways than the Jewish people. The Jewish people had the foundation of special revelation. The Gentiles who received the good news from Jews such as Paul and all the rest, they only had natural revelation, but having all the advanced revelation now, that with revelation comes responsibility, so we are not absolved of our duty, responsibility, and obligation to faithfully obey and maintain and preserve our obedience and the integrity thereof. He again defines a certain day, today, saying through David so much later as it has been today. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. This time he, interestingly enough, acknowledges the human authorship, David, who wrote under the influence and the power and inspiration of the Ruach Kadesh. Earlier in this chapter, in some translations, it says that Elohim spoke, for he, but it's Elohim in the third verse. But the same thing is said that we've already heard before, and this lesson was imparted at least 400 years after the fact from the Exodus to the establishment of the monarchy. So this was inspired. David had the history as recorded in the laws of Moses, but he also had the inspiration of the Ruach Kodesh, who animated unto a new revelation, a new word that was present and palpable in his generation, and because the temptation for apostasy is always alive, present, and dangerous, not only in Israel but also in the church. And you don't want to harden your hearts or develop or cultivate unbelief or doubt or anything else, because the imminence and the essentialness from our standpoint, we are not, from a cosmic scheme, our salvation is not necessary, but it is necessary for us, because what do we read in Acts 4:12, the one name by which we must be saved, that stresses the imperative necessity for ourselves, from our own vantage point, to reach salvation. God is a self-created, self-sufficient, self-satisfying being who is completely and totally satisfied in himself. Him extending us life is not motivated by necessity but benevolence. So too is his impartation of salvation. That is something he deigns to give to us creatures of dust. And may we always never lose sight of the gratitude, the debt of gratitude that we owe him, an incalculable one, and he paid the price for it ourselves in the form of his son on the cross. For if Joshua established them in rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So Joshua was Moses' designated successor. He and Caleb were of the 12 individual delegates from the 12 tribes of Israel who were sent to scout the promised land. Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb from the tribe of Judah alone responded with faith. The rest responded in fear, because there was literal giants, and because their scouting expedition lasted 38 days, and because the camp of Israel took counsel with the consensus of these reports that there were literal giants, we can't take it. The duration of their wilderness wandering was added to another 38 years, a year for each day that the scouting expedition was gone. This was at the 2-year point of the Exodus, but Joshua did live to enter into the promised land. He is the conquering general who swept through Jericho, and all the things we can read of his conquest in the first 12 chapters of the book which bears his name, and also the divisions and allotments of the lands in the final 12. But the temporal rest of the promised land, the land of milk and honey, they would be stationary, they would be civilized, they would be free, they would own homes, they would own property, they would distribute money, things they couldn't do as slaves. And this was a rest from that life of toil. And Joshua was able to enter into it, Joshua and Caleb, because they were faithful. All the rest expired premature to that point, who were present in that generation. So there remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of Elohim. This Sabbath keeping is traditionally celebrated by Christians on Sunday. That is our day of worship, but it is in fact a pagan introduction. The Emperor Constantine was and remained a devotee of the Persian sun deity Mithras, even after his Christian conversion. So there's a lot of pagan elements, I don't have time to get into it, which were introduced by the Emperor Constantine. And of all the Roman emperors, the ones who persecuted Christians, they killed Christians, but he sort of, in a major way, killed Christianity, at least crippled it for the better part of a millennia. For the one having entered into his rest has himself also rested from his works, as Elohim from his own. So there's no such thing as working for salvation. You can work your fingers dry to the bone. That will not save you. We have to. The rest is offered, and the one who offers it, he can uniquely satisfy our vacancy and our longing for rest. He says, "Come to me, all ye who are heavy laden and burdened, and I will give you rest." Now, his original audience may have been heavy laden with the excessive legalistic demands of the Pharisees. To become one of their disciples was a burden to bear and a yoke to carry. But he said, you will not, you are free from the slave mentality of earning your salvation of works. You are free to do good works because you are saved. You are not saved because you do good works. So salvation by legalism is invalidated by the truth and the reality not only the New Testament. Let us therefore do our utmost to enter into that rest, lest anyone fall after the same example of disobedience. So this is a struggle. It is a challenge. Once more, there's nothing automatic. There's nothing guaranteed. There are conditions, and the ingredients for those conditions are faith and obedience, that we can enter into that rest. We can claim the promise and enter into that blessed abode and experience for an eternity. But, we can fall. We can be saved one day and lose our salvation the next. This gets us into the theological debate of permanent assurance, assurance being the term of the certainty of one's salvation. And I personally reject the doctrine of permanent assurance, once saved, always saved. I believe you can, and it is communicated in passages such as 10:26-27, and also 2 Peter 20:21, and also John 15:2-6, that I can rest my case on for that argument. So we want to be mindful that this is a labor, this is a struggle. We don't really cease working. We just cease working our way to salvation. We have to work to maintain the faith and obedience. It does not come natural. It is imparted supernaturally. For the word of Yahweh is living and working, and sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting through even to the dividing of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. That Yahweh speaks is made plain as early as the first verse of the first chapter. He spoke through the prophets, and then through most forcefully and fully and finally through his Son. He is our supreme form of revelation. So the word of Yahweh is not limited to the scripture alone, but also extends into the word which spoke the creation into existence, and the word, the incarnate one. It is any word that proceedeth from his mouth. It doesn't have to be recorded in scriptures. He speaks to individuals, and that word is the same. It is not dead. It is active, dynamic. It is busy, and the word which is translated as sword is a dagger. So this would have been a two-edged one would have been sharper than a single blade. And the power of the word is that it penetrates into our inner being, exposes our substance, leaves it naked and bare. We read in the next verse. So through the word, and by the word I mean the scriptures, we come to see ourselves, how God sees us. And it's not always pleasant and it's not always pretty, but when you have the conviction, when some sin screams to you to repent and convict, that is the word taking effect, and you should be grateful that you are even bothered and pricked by your conscience by this word calling out to you. It will expose your innermost secrets, and there is no invisible eye in Yahweh who sees all, who knows all, and his perfect and complete total knowledge is reflected in his word. This is everything we need to know. Basic instructions before leaving earth. Bible, Bible. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all are naked and laid bare before the eyes of him, with whom is our account. With whom is our account? This is the one to whom we must answer to when we die, for it is appointed for men to die once, and then they must answer in the judgment. And you can run, but you not for long, and you certainly can't hide from the eye in the sky, the one we must all answer to and give an account for the life that we live. No creature means everything in creation. The lion will dwell with the lamb, so animals are part of the redeemed new earth and the new Jerusalem. But we are naked and exposed, that we are vulnerable when reading the word, and that vulnerability is good because it can prompt and stimulate the conviction. And we have to see ourselves how God sees us, and to get into his mind and to acquire his perspective and vantage point, we need to get in this word. Keep your nose in it all the time. Keep your knees on the floor in prayer, and keep your eyes on the prize in heaven. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.